I'm Amir Alwani reporting for PotentNews.com. I'm going to read a letter that I wrote. Since 1913, the U.S. has long been taken over, infested, and hijacked via the Federal Reserve Act. The U.S. now imposes draconian legislation like the NDAA, which includes key provisions which annihilate the right to a lawyer, jury trial, or any of those nice things. The U.S. is also, like Russia and China, engaged in aerosol operations that often purport to be about harmless weather modification in an effort to supposedly mitigate global warming. Skies are littered with toxins daily, and this has been heavily documented here at PotentNews.com and many other alternative news sources. Even some mainstream media has discussed this issue from time to time, as it is of grave concern. Many argue that even these various aerosol operations amount to nothing less than the deployment of chemical weapons. Soil and rain samples in many places confirm the presence of abnormally high levels of toxic heavy metals. River samples confirm the presence of nanotechnology being littered in our environment, and whether that be from food, from aerosol operations, medication, clothes, or anything else, the entire field of nanotechnology should be called into question. The health hazards these new tiny machines pose are likely to be dramatic, and when one looks into Morgellons syndrome, it is then particularly difficult to not recoil in horror. Sugarcoating that reality with pretty words like geoengineering or solar radiation management is not going to fool people forever. In addition, the resulting environmental degradation is already being witnessed now in the form of damaged crops and trees worldwide, drastically altered pH levels in the soils, increased forest fires due to the presence of flammable aerosols soaked into the earth and plants, reduced visibility, and some say gigantic methane releases. We also see the increasing rates of respiratory illnesses and neurodegenerative disease. The fact that there is little critical analysis with respect to geoengineering is no accident. It has been normalized via propaganda in films and commercials. In light of these facts and many more I don't have time to mention, it is not feasible that the US government is being genuine in their aspirations for justice in the Middle East or anywhere else. I repeat, the US itself is a totalitarian state as illustrated by the NDAA, and is also guilty of using chemical weapons on its own population by means of aerosol operations. This has been happening for decades, well, not the NDAA part, but the aerosol operations part. But the aerosol operations have increased in scope a number of times recently. Despite this, the US has been among the most vocal in demonizing Syria, baselessly accusing it of using chemical weapons against its own people. Let me be clear, I have no love for Bashar. In fact, one of my cousins was tortured by Bashar's men merely for smoking weed, and this happened a year or two before 2011 when the unrest began. I am under no illusions about how barbaric that government is. Without going into details, I will say that throughout this crisis, my relatives have indeed felt the force of Bashar's unjustifiably heavy-handed crackdown. In addition, because of the general violence occurring, many of my relatives have become refugees. Do I primarily blame Assad for this, the dictator who, by the way, had men torturing innocent Canadian citizen Maher Arar back in 2002 on behalf of the US government? Does anybody remember that? No? Anyway, I do not mindlessly only blame the Syrian government for the recent unrest and all the suffering my relatives have recently had to go through, no matter how heavy-handed the regime's reaction to the invasion has been. Of course, the regime deserves some blame, but the mercenaries and extremists deserve much more. They have infested Syria the past 2 years, giving Assad the excuse to crack down the way he did, but also giving Assad a run for his money with respect to how ruthless one could act. There are shitloads of videos online showing the Free Syrian Army's brutal and inhumane ways. Google them. All this was backed by Western, US, NATO, Israel, GCC state powers, etc. I visited Damascus in mid-2008. It was a great experience. I had a great time. I visited mosques that had such intricately beautiful geometric shapes built into their architecture, and it made me think that whoever designed them must have been tripping hard on some powerful psychedelic drug. I saw people taking off their shoes and kissing the ground before entering these holy sites. A couple months ago, I saw a Russia Today video that reported on a Free Syrian Army attack on a holy site, and I actually recognized this site from my visit in 2008. These invaders have left quite the mark on Damascus and the rest of Syria. Syria has been defending itself from a bloodthirsty, ruthless foreign invasion, and the antagonists are comprised of many interested parties taking advantage of what they can. It's a clusterfuck. The influx of militants, mercenaries, and extremists invading Syria is unjustified and has resulted in many refugees fleeing the country, but it is important to note that Syria was wiping out the terrorists quite effectively at the time the regime was accused of needlessly resorting to chemical weapons. This was even after the terrorists had gained a reputation for going around doing things like slitting the throats of children, attacking Christians, Druze, and others, showing off their chemical weapons, testing on rabbits, and generally causing as much destruction as possible. Also, the morale of the people there has been impressive. My cousin was doing university exams while hearing bombs and artillery fire flying around him. Here's a picture of the front of his university where you can see guns and sandbags on either side of the roof. He endured that kind of lifestyle for a long time. He was happy though. He seemed happier than most people I see in Canada. So why is this country being attacked? Like I said, there are many interested parties and many details I don't have time to get into in this video, but I will point out that many people have the misconception that these wars are only about stealing natural resources like oil, for example. But there is no reason that the wars can't be about stealing oil and also be about other things at the same time.
Most people make a mistake when they look at war, and they believe that war is about the control of natural resources. Oil, agricultural land, gold, you name it. And once they've pierced through the veil of propaganda about the noble virtue of whoever's doing the violence, they think that somehow it's control of a basket of resources that are used to then create wealth for the state and fund the military and so on. This is a fundamental mistake. And as long as you make this mistake, if you are making this mistake, you will not, I think, see through the fog of war to what is really going on. It's true that wars are fought to control resources, but they are not resources from nature alone. The resources that are controlled in any attempt to gain control of a government are human beings. Human beings are the fundamental and ultimate resource in the world. You can't expect oil to walk itself out of the ground, and crops do not fertilize plant and reap themselves. It is human beings that fundamentally are trying to be controlled, trying to be managed, trying to be restricted, trying to be taxed, when you have any group, whether internal or external, trying to gain control of a state. And this is what is occurring in Syria. There's a despot in power, and there are people who are frustrated at their lack of freedoms who are attempting to gain control of the state. What that means is to gain control of the tax livestock. You have to look at this as if you were a cow in a field, going to be milked, going to get your babies taken away from you, you're going to end up in a slaughterhouse, and there are two farmers who are trying to gain control of the farm. And what does this mean? Well, it means that two people, or two groups of people, or two sections, or two factions, or two religious groups, or whatever, are trying to gain control of you. Now, the ironic thing, of course, is that people get frustrated when you have an overly restrictive tax farmer at the helm, and so some new group comes along and says, don't worry, we're going to set you free, which is like expecting a man to invest $1 million in a farm to do what? To turn the livestock free? Of course not. No, he's going to continue to exploit the farm and take the meat and take the milk and take the babies and take the crops and all that kind of stuff. So it's true that there is a resource being fought over, but that resource fundamentally is human beings. People try to gain control of the state so they can use the state to extract money and resources from citizens.
Yes, sir. Yes. You know, I see the Western world going around the world bombing it, as particularly the Islamic world, but it's also been involved in other wars in Asia, Korea, Vietnam. But all the time, what it's doing is actually creating refugees and importing them into the Western big cities, into America, the United Kingdom. And I wonder, is this not a really essential part of their war aims, to assimilate indigenous people and to break up closed communities that occur naturally in the Islamic world, for example in Afghanistan? Are they not out to socially engineer a class of person that has no tribal loyalties and no attachment to the land?
I want to introduce you to a terminology that with which you would have been familiar when you were a schoolboy. What they're doing is they're creating carbon copies of themselves. You know about carbon copies.
Yes.
The entire effort is directed towards reproducing their way of life all over the world at the expense of indigenous ways of life. This is not happening by accident. This is an essential dimension of what is called globalization. It is not simply a matter of creating a world government. And one of the first important steps in the direction of that world government was the Western armies that launched wars all over the non-Western world, wars of aggression to colonize India, colonize Africa, colonize Malaya, colonize South America. And as you colonize these non-Western societies, you then establish institutions which would allow you to continue to influence them and to change them by proxy. So you can decolonize and get them to believe that they are no longer colonized, that they now have political freedom, and they now have economic freedom. But that's just dust in their eyes. You are actually ruling them by proxy. There was also the educational dimension of this process of westernization, political, economic, educational, cultural, even cuisine.
Thank you for watching Potent News Blast number 11. I hope you had a fucking blast.